least in my country. Okay, so I'd like to begin by thanking all of these people who actually did all of the work, not me. And I should also thank all of the people who paid for it, but I forgot to put their logos on the slide, so never mind. Will press lever for food. So we heard from Mass this really nice introduction that our core concept is that we do something and it produces a result. In this case, you press the lever, you get the food. And that's a very common architectural feature of many, many agency situations. They all seem to have that in common. That there's an action and then there's some result, in this case a rather pleasant one. And the basic fundamental relation between action and outcome would seem to go very deep back into our evolutionary past, because animals get it. I think animals would probably have a sense of agency if they could do intentional binding experiments. But the basic relation between the action and the outcome is really pervasive in our everyday life. So technology came up a little bit in the discussion. So one of the interesting things about the human mind is it's been able to support these extremely mediated relations between actions and outcomes. So you press a button here and then it ends up telling you how to get to the airport, and somehow you get to the airport. Communication, I'm not going to talk much about, but one interesting feature about communication in social species such as ourselves is that maybe what we're doing is we are making an action which produces an outcome. So I don't know, it looks to me like the dad is saying something very cross and the son is smiling, so that possibly wasn't the outcome that was intended, but nevertheless the model fits. What I thought I'd talk about today is a little bit specific. So I'm going to be talking mostly about what I call action selection and the role of action selection in the sense of agency. Well, let me explain why. In all of these situations, there's a relation between an action and an outcome. And the question really is at the cognitive or experiential level, how is that relation captured in the human mind? And one of the most basic ways in which we need to capture that is we need to learn action-outcome mappings. We need to learn that action 1 produces outcome 1, and action 2 produces outcome 2, and action 3 produces outcome 3. And that's really useful if we additionally have the capacity to choose whether we want to do action 1 and produce outcome 1, or whether we'd rather do action 2 and produce outcome 2, or whether we'd rather do action 3 and produce outcome 3. So if you put together the capacity to link actions and outcomes with the capacity to select or choose between different outcomes, you have a powerful cocktail, powerful combination. And in the classic neurocomputational models, which Mass has described, I don't need to go through it again, this idea of action selection has perhaps been underemphasized. So the normal way that people think about sense of agency is that you have an intention, you generate a motor command, you have a prediction about what the motor command will do, and you compare sensory feedback from your body and also from the external event. So in this diagram, I actually I've assumed the answer to the question that the body and the world are actually more or less the same thing, because they send sensory feedback down pretty much the same channels. So I sort of finesse that question. And if what you predict happens is the same as what feedback tells you actually happens, then you conclude that, oh, it must have been me. So you can attribute agency to yourself for all the stuff that happened because it was predictable from your motor command. So that's the sort of standard Fritz Blakemore type way of thinking about sense of agency. And I want to just introduce something which, not to criticize those models at all, but to try and add an important element which I think does explain what it's like to feel sense of agency in everyday life, which is the selection element. So there is a selection element in this model anyway, because there's a thing called a planner or an inverse model whose job is to take a description of the goal and select the appropriate motor command. So if my goal is to switch the light on, I can use my right hand, I can use my left hand. If my hands are full, I can use my head and hit the light switch. There are different motor commands I can use to achieve a goal. That's often called movement selection. All cognitive models have this interesting feature that there's always one box with no input, right? So you think, wow, what gets that one started? And in this model, of course, it's goals. So this model says nothing about what our goals are or what our intentions are or where they come from. And I mean, you'll see that I'm postulating a process of goal selection. You have to work out what you want to try and do, and you'll notice that this has no input either. So I'm just deferring the philosophical problem really, but there is this question about, well, what do I actually want to do? So two selection problems, and it seems to me that those processes of selection play a strong role in linking actions to outcomes and in producing the sense of agency, and that's slightly been neglected in the literature up to now, including in my own studies, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. Now, the dominant way in psychology that people think about agency is anti-selection. It disagrees with the idea that there are selections, that there are choices, that people choose, that this matters, and that this underlies our feeling of being in control. So what most people in psychology seem to think, particularly if they're social psychologists, particularly if they're in North America, and if they're North American social psychologists, almost certainly, they think that we don't know what we select and we don't know why we select it. We don't really have a process of choice. We have an illusion of choice, but we don't have a real bona fide cognitive process of choice. Rather, what we do is we find that choices have been made. We find that we're doing stuff, perhaps because we've been unconsciously influenced by our environments, which we certainly have. We find that we're doing stuff, and we retrospectively invent narratives, stories, false stories, because they're illusory, stories about what we're choosing and why. And perhaps the neatest example of this is the work by Petter Johansson, which was extremely influential when it was published in Science relatively recently. So this is a quite elegant way of demonstrating this. As I understand how the experiment works, it works like this. The participant is presented with two pictures. And the question, which is a little bit old-fashioned to my mind, is which one of these two people do you want to date? So I'm not sure I would have quite phrased it like that. But that's, as I understand it, what they asked. And the participant in this case says, well, I'd like to date this person here. Now, the experimenter, who is in fact a trained magician, right, then places the two cards which the participant has inspected face down, so you can see the red back of the card there, and by a sleight of hand swaps the two cards without the participant realizing that this has happened. So this is one of these things where they sort of stick the card up their sleeve, or they have a spare card, I don't know, hidden in their palm, or one of those things. I don't quite understand it, but it's a trick. The experimenter plays a trick on the participant, and then the participant takes the card that they have chosen, turns it over, and is invited to explain why they chose that person to go on the date with and why the date is going to be fantastic. They're asked to explain the reasons for their choice. So what you can see is that this participant chose the face here with the dark hair, and when they actually turn over the card, what they see is the other person whom they previously hadn't chosen. But they nevertheless present extremely convincing reasons to say why they want to date the person that they're now looking at. They don't seem to realize that the fate they've got is actually changed, and they start to say things, well, I actually prefer blonde hair to dark hair and stuff like that. All right? So they retrospectively confabulate reasons for their selection. And that sort of implies that there isn't actually any strong signal or any strong experience associated with this initial selection that they made, because it can be so easily controverted and sort of restructured. All right? So that, I think, is the way that most people in the field think about sense of agency, about voluntary choice. And it's a rather sort of dismissive view. And the question is it right? Well, first of all, there's no doubt that this does happen. There's no doubt that we do retrospectively confabulate to explain the stupid decisions that we make and the funny situations that we find ourselves in. Nobody is denying the two premises of this work, namely that we're unconsciously influenced by our environment and that we retrospectively create reasons to explain what we do in our environment. The question is whether there's anything else, whether there's any actual signal associated with choice, whether we can talk legitimately about choice in the brain, and what role choosing action 1, action 2, action 3, and getting outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3, what role does that actually play in our sense of agency at all? So what I'm going to tell you very briefly is 3 sort of classes of experiment, varying from the relatively straightforward to the more baroque, looking at this idea that selection actually really is important in sense of agency, action selection. So easy action selection boosts sense of agency. Mass helpfully has done all the preliminary work, so I don't need to say very much. You've seen a slide rather like this before. So this is the work of Neurosidaris, and it's using the same kind of paradigm that was presented in the previous talk, where you use subliminal priming to make it easy or difficult for people to choose an action. Their action then has an outcome, and you ask whether the ease or difficulty of selecting the action influences your feeling of control over the outcome. Right? The experimental paradigm is a little bit baroque, so let's look first of all here at these 2 columns on the right. In fact, let's look at this 3rd column first of all. Right? So you're fixating, you very, very briefly get a 13 millisecond flashed arrow pointing to the right. There's a little gap, and it's followed by a much larger arrow also pointing to the right. And because this is brief and followed by this initial subliminal prime is not seen. You're not consciously aware of it. And we can do tests using D prime type identification studies at the end of the experiment to show that people didn't see that subliminal prime. However, even though they didn't see it, it got into their brain, and it made it easy for them to respond to the big, supraliminal, highly visible arrow pointing to the right, and it made them faster, therefore, to press the button with their right hand. So the subliminal prime here influences the ease or difficulty of selecting the appropriate action in response to this supraliminal target arrow. After you've pressed the button with your right hand, there's a gap which is variable, 400 or 600 milliseconds in this experiment. That may be important later. And then you get a patch of colour on the screen, and you're asked to make an explicit rating about how much control you have over the colour that appeared on the screen. There are lots of colours appearing on the screen. I'm going to describe that aspect later. So that is a trial where you've been compatibly primed, because the prime told you to go to the right, and then the real instruction said, yes, yes, really do go to the right. You went to the right and you got a colour, and you had to judge how much control. The alternative possibility is that the subliminal prime is trying to make it difficult to choose the right action in response to the supraliminal target, because here the subliminal prime points to the left, so it's like somebody's whispering in your ear, hey, go left. But then the actual instruction is, no, the right. So you press the button with your right hand, and you get a different colour here, and you judge how much control you've had over the outcome. So the critical point here is that we can either make action selection easy by giving a compatible prime, or difficult by giving an incompatible prime. And the point here is that the colours that we show are not related to the actions directly. So in both of these cases, you're making a right-handed action in response to a right target. You're getting 2 different colours. Some of the colours that you get are specific to the case where you've been compatibly primed, whereas other colours are specific to the case where you're incompatibly primed. The action-outcome relation, okay, is statistically identical in the 2 cases, but the action-selection fluency outcome relation is different. Okay? On the left, you see a rather interesting condition. I'm also interested in volition. I'm also interested in, if you like, where do our actions come from? So here we have a situation where you're primed either to the right or to the left, but the actual instruction now is a double-headed arrow. It's ambiguous, and it means, well, you can do whatever you want. You can either press with your left hand or press with your right hand. It is up to you. And the interesting thing is that the person is going to make a, quote, free, unquote, choice. They're going to press the button, they're going to get a colour, and they're going to rate how much control they have of the outcome. And our interesting question there is, do they feel more control over the outcome when they happen to have, quote, freely, unquote, chosen exactly what we had subliminally tried to put into their head with the prime? Or on the other hand, do they feel more in control when they resist the external influence of the world and they endogenously express something deep within themselves, cutting off all of these sort of unconscious suggestions? Okay, everybody happy with that? It's a little bit baroque. Yeah?
How do they judge whether they were successful or not? Because if you're judging control, obviously there's a measure of whether you've successfully controlled. So if you have different colours, are they aware of which colours? Is there some kind of correcting then?
Nobody tells them what colour means what. So they just have to judge how much control they have over the colour that appeared on the screen. And that's a bit bizarre because you are the only person pressing the button.
Okay.
When you press the button, you always get a colour.
Okay.
Of course I made that colour appear on the screen. You know, how could I not be in control? So it's a very good point. So one problem with these kinds of experiments is, you know, the default assumption that one's action causes the outcome is very, very, very strong. Why would I not feel total control of the colour that's on the screen? And to address that question...
Can I just ask about that, just clarify as well? So control that it appears, or control that it is green rather than blue, or control that...
We don't say that.
Okay.
The question is, how much control do you have over what happened on the screen?
Okay.
Right? So we don't tell them the dimensions of the outcome. And I think that's fair enough, because in life, you know, you do stuff, outcomes happen, and there's lots of features of outcomes, and you've got to try and work out what it means. Do you remember I said briefly that there's a variable delay between action and outcome? So in this particular experiment, you could either wait 400 milliseconds after pressing the button before you got a colour, or you could wait 600. Now it turns out that temporal delay has a very, very strong influence on your feeling of control. So when things happen immediately, you feel more in control. When they happen with a delay, you feel less in control. That is not a variable of interest in this experiment. But we put it in because it means that we believe that people will therefore sometimes feel more control, sometimes feel less control, feel that there's actually something that they can plausibly report when they give their ratings using this rating scale. So there are a number of, if you like, experimental tricks that we use to ensure that people don't sort of say, yeah, well, look, it's obvious I'm in control because I pressed the button, didn't I, mate? Right? So we need to introduce an element of variability and uncertainty using the standard psychological principle that if you want people to judge something, you want the thing judged to vary a bit. All right? And we do that using dummy variables, and there are a number of ways you can do it. One is to vary this delay. The other one is that it actually probably doesn't matter how many colours you have here. What matters is that there are lots of colours, so that people assume, right, well, sometimes I'm getting green, sometimes red. Okay, so in principle, you could do this experiment always with the same colour, but in practice, here I think we've got 4 colours. Sometimes we've had 16, so that the particular combination of a prime, target, and action might produce any one of several colours equiprobably. So you just need to produce some reason why people might think that control does vary. Yeah?
But isn't it a slight problem that you keep the colors steady in one condition? Wouldn't you be, because you of course feel maybe that it's harder when I was primed before, though I don't know it, right? To connect the red after a while also as a learning effect to, so you're primed kind of by the color.
I think that's what we mean. So I think what we're trying to do really is, so we know that you don't see the prime. Okay,
Yeah.
we know that you don't see the prime, but the assumption is that there's something about the experience of choosing, which is easy when the prime helps you to choose which hand to select the action in response to the supraliminal target, and is difficult when you've been incompatibly primed.
Yeah.
And specific colours are associated with that putative feeling. And the question is, does that putative feeling of easy choice or difficult choice contribute to your judgment of control over the colour? Now, if you only knew about your actions and their outcomes retrospectively, then that could not be the case. So if you were a strict Dennett-Wegener disciple, so I think that Daniel Wegener, in fact, was not such a Wegnerian as we sometimes like to point out. And I think a lot of this view that we merely retrospectively confabulate our own agency actually comes from Daniel Dennett as much as from Daniel Wegener. I think if you were a strict Dennett-Wegener retrospectivist, what you would say is, you find your finger on the button, either the right button or the left button, you see the colour on the screen, you say, oh, Patrick, you must have planned to do that, so therefore you must control it. You only retrospectively infer from the action and the outcome how much control you had, and you would not have any access to the mechanism by which you chose the action.
So that would mean that afterwards, if you would give them the colors in the wrong way, they would maybe still respond because they see green.
It must be easy.
It must be.
That's a really good question. Nobody's done it. I have one slide coming up which is at least relevant to that very clever suggestion. Okay, right. So the point is that the primes by themselves, these subliminal primes, do not predict the outcomes, right? So you can't predict the outcome based on the prime, but they do influence the level of fluency or alternatively conflict/disfluency in the action selection process. So if action selection really does contribute to our sense of control and our feeling of agency, then you'd expect the prime compatibility or incompatibility to make a difference. Right, so the first question is, do these primes actually get into the brain at all? We know that they're not consciously perceived, but it turns out they do affect people's reaction time to press the button when this subsequent supraliminal target instruction is given. All right, so this is what you actually respond to here, and it turns out that your response time, if we just look here at force choices, this is where you get a left pointing or a right pointing arrow telling you which key to press. Your reaction times are lower in grey when you've been compatibly primed than when you're incompatibly primed. In the case of the free choice trials, the meaning of compatibility is a little bit different, because in the case of a free choice trial, what compatible means is that we primed you to the left, and then you, quote, freely, unquote, chose to press with your left hand when we gave you the choice about which hand to choose, rather than choosing the other hand. But nevertheless, what we find is that people are quicker when they are, as it were, unconsciously biased by the subliminal prime than when they're not. And if you look at which hand they actually choose in the free choice condition, they tend to prefer to choose the hand that we subliminally suggested that they choose. So the subliminal priming is working, that's absolutely fine. But the interesting thing is if you look at the agency rating, so these are on this Likert scale that we use, we'll look at the force choice first, you get a very slightly higher feeling of control when you have pressed a button that was suggested by a compatible prime that you did not even see, compared to when you pressed a button where the prime had not helped you press the button because it had suggested you go in the other direction. Sorry, that's a little bit complicated. Is that clear?
Yeah.
All right, so here what you can look at is either actions which are easy to make because the prime helped you to select the right action, or actions that were harder to make because the prime didn't help. And you find there's a slight but significant and reliable greater sense of control over the outcome when you've been compatibly primed. The same is true for free choice, so when you go with the flow of the subliminal prime and you let your free will be driven by this subliminal prime, you actually feel more in control. So that's, in a way, quite paradoxical. So we feel more in control of what we're doing when we're actually influenced from the outside. It's a little bit interesting. Okay, so what's the brain basis of this? Well, we've recently done exactly this experiment in EEG. So we can define, these are the events in the experimental paradigm, the prime, the target, the action, the outcome. And we can define a set of sort of putative cognitive processes which these correspond to. And the really sharp decision is between all of the cognitive processes which are associated with selecting what action to make and the cognitive process of monitoring what the subsequent outcome is. So there's a sharp divide, in the way I view agency at least, between what one might call the controller, the action and the outcome, the command signal, the result, the controller and the plant. And we're going to look, I'm just going to show you one slide, which is what happens in the brain at the time that you make the action, independently of what happens in the brain at the later time that you get the outcome. And we're going to be looking particularly at a potential time lock to the action, which occurs in advance of the outcome. So here are EEG signals measured over the frontal cortex. Negative is always plotted up in sort of classical EEG research. And 0 here, this line, is the moment that you press the button. This is the moment that you press the button. So shortly after you press the button, you get a deflection, which has been called the CRN. We don't need to go into the details. And this deflection is thought to be something to do with the process of selecting and making and executing the action. So it's the last part of the action selection process, what drives you to actually make the action. And the interesting finding is that you get a significant difference with a slightly more positive deflection when you happen to press the button and then subsequently, much later, report that you had high control over the outcome than when you had low control. So there's something happening at the time of the action which already seems to be sensitive to how much control you'll feel over a patch of colour on the screen which hasn't yet happened. All right? So you can't just be waiting for the outcome and then trying to retrospectively infer how much control you had. There's something happening at the time of action selection. So here's the sort of stats model where on a trial-to-trial basis we look at the extent to which judgments of agency depend on, do you make free choices or forced choices? Yes, that does matter because people always feel more in control when they choose for themselves what to do than when they're told what to do. Compatible priming produces stronger sense of agency than incompatible priming, but trials which have a strong action CRN also tend to produce stronger sense of agency than trials which don't. So processes for action selection contribute to sense of agency as in addition to processing of the outcomes. Now I just want to come on to the question that, or something which obliquely addresses Katrine's question. So when I told somebody, in fact it was Chris Frith, about these results, he said, well this is just because people are making a mistake. What you're doing with a subliminal prime is you're producing an internal metacognitive signal of fluency. And people are not very good at understanding or attributing or identifying feelings. And they're mistaking the feeling of fluency when they choose for the feeling of agency over outcomes. People are just, they've got a sort of subjective sensational feeling about what they're doing, and they don't really understand it, and they're confusing fluency and agency, which I thought was a good point. And that leads to a couple of quite interesting hypotheses about learning, because the aim in these experiments is to report agency. So one possibility is that you come into the experiment, and at the start of the block, you really don't know much at all about pressing buttons and getting outcomes. So you start to perform the block, and you gradually come to associate the ease with which you choose what to do. I just want to pause and check that I'm going to get this right. Yeah, you gradually come to associate the ease with which you press the button with the actual true relation between the action and the outcome, which you are constantly monitoring. So the concept here is that you start off in any agency situation making actions, monitoring outcomes, making actions, monitoring outcomes, and then you gradually begin to realize that, when the action and the outcome go together, I felt it was easy to make the action. You learn that selection fluency is a good proxy for action-outcome control. And if that's true, then if you plot the feeling of agency as a function of the trial number, initially the difference between incompatible primes in red and compatible primes in green should be very low. And as you keep going through the block, you should learn, when it's easy to choose, then that means I'm controlling it. You should learn the meaning of your own metacognitive signals. The other hypothesis is completely the opposite, which suggests that when you go into a situation, you've got no idea about the true action-outcome relations, but you come in with a prior experience which you've had from the rest of your previous life, that if you know what to do, then you must be in control. And I think you get this a lot when you travel to a foreign city and you go to the machine where you have to buy the metro ticket, because for me, if it's in London, I sort of go up to the machine and think, easy, right, I know what to do. Press, yeah. Oyster card, travel card, zone 1, zone 3, Heathrow, whatever. You go to a different city, you look at the machine, you think, Christ, what do I press here? And you already feel out of control before you even press anything. So just the disfluency of not knowing what button to press on the machine produces this total feeling of lack of agency. And then there are always 5 or 6 people in the queue behind you making comments like, why do people so slow buying their tickets, and don't they realize how easy it is? But of course it's not. So this concept here is that really when you come into a situation, you start by using action selection fluency as a heuristic, and then you gradually learn what the real relation between the action and the outcome is. So you'd start off being prospective and predictive, and you'd end up being, if you like, measuring true agency in terms of action-outcome relations. So on this view, you should have a high priming effects, high action priming effects at the start of the block, which should diminish over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification. When you talk about outcome here, are you talking about the color?
Yes, the colour in this experiment is the outcome. So a slightly weak point, I suppose, of what I'm saying is that in these experiments the outcome doesn't actually vary very much. I think in real life action-outcome relations vary rather more than they do in these experiments.
But the colors were yoked to the direction.
Of the colours correspond to the prime action relation.
Right.
So the action itself doesn't predict the colour, the prime itself doesn't predict the colour, but the relation between them does predict the colour. Okay? I think the critical thing probably is that people have an experience of action selection when they're primed, and we need some way to get them to use that experience in their report of agency.
I was just wondering, if you tried to do these experiments in a game setting versus a real life setting, would you expect the results to be the same?
Don't see why not.
Okay. So, I mean, just
Yeah.
no, because a lot of people working with games, I mean, you have this action outcome type of relationship.
And so I'm going to stop you. Do you mean video games or neuroeconomic games? Because I
video-
suddenly realised that your question I hadn't
Yeah,
understood.
video games, sorry.
Video games. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Well, I guess it's the same. Yeah. So I mean, action-outcome relations are pervasive.
Okay.
I would have thought. Yeah. So I would see if I can get to the end of this slide, because then you might decide that actually it's not, the question is not relevant, or the topic is right. So what we've shown here is the results of a meta-analysis where we've got the trial number during the course of a block along the x-axis, and the control rating that you feel you have over the outcome, the colour that appears on the screen, in green when you were compatibly primed, and in red when you were incompatibly primed. And there are two plots. And the first plot is actually done by Nuris Sidaris, and the second plot is the meta-analysis of the experiments by Valérian Chambon. These are two people who work with me. And it's quite interesting because the two experimenters produce different results. Nura's experiments tend to produce something which clearly looks like this pattern. So as the block goes on, the effect of action selection fluency on feeling of control tends to increase. Okay, so you tend to use your kind of feeling of, oh yeah, I know what to do, that was easy, yes, let's go left, yes, let's go right. You tend to use that more and more as the basis for your feeling of control. So it looks as though people are gradually learning how to select actions easily and quickly, and they're using that as a heuristic, almost as if I don't need to track the actual outcome relation because I just know what to do. Of course I'm in control, it's easy, all right? And Valérian's experiments don't show that trend at all. And it turns, this is retrospective, but it turns out that these experiments tend to use rather less variable action-outcome intervals, typically just 400 or 600 milliseconds. And that means you've got a pretty strong prediction, at least about when the outcome is going to appear. And these experiments tend to use highly variable action-outcome intervals with several different delays, which tends to mean that you can't really predict when the colour is going to come up on the screen. Now that's a post hoc inference, but it suggests to me that maybe when the world is sort of predictable and well behaved and you can generally understand what's going on, then just being able to choose what to do is a pretty good guide to what's going to happen. When the world is a little bit chaotic or more variable, then okay, well I know how I'm choosing, but that doesn't mean that the world's going to go my way. So maybe what happens with sets of agency is that we either use internal prospective signals or we use retrospective signals. We try and combine them in the way that best suits the schedule. That's, I think, entirely compatible with something like the Bayesian model that Moore proposed. So I just thought I'd show that. Now, that's the end, I think, of a section. So I'll put up that and I won't talk about it. If anybody has any questions about that section, this is a good moment. I don't know if you want to ask your questions still. Yeah.
I think I have two questions. So one is, did you, in any of these cases, ask the participants which aspect of the task that they were judging agency of. So, was it the interval? Was it the color?
Right. I mean,
could you in some way post hoc interview them and say, so what was actually the part of the experiment?
Yeah, I don't think we have a formal debriefing interview here. I mean, people tend to sort of say, oh, well, I tried to figure it out. It's difficult to exclude a sort of a demand or experimenter effect that people are trying to... So you're giving people this very artificial, how much in control do you have over the outcome? This is a judgment that you never make in real life, right? So it's very difficult to exclude the possibility that people think, gosh, what a stupid question. What on earth do they mean? Do they mean the delay? Do they mean the colour? It's very difficult to exclude the possibility that people are trying to work out what the experiment's about. My hope is that what people are trying to do is to make a synthetic judgment based on all of the things that are relevant to how they represent the action, the outcome, and the relation between them, because that's what agency is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they could articulate that in a post-experiment interview. That's our job.
Second question, so the reaction times, they are sort of reversed, so they have the slow reaction times in the high judgments. So is it just a matter of judging your reaction time, that when you're quick, you feel...
Great question. Great question. Very good question. We hope not, because if people are just figuring out their agency based on their reaction time, then it could be completely retrospective. You don't need to posit any use of any internal choice or selection signal at all. In one experiment, we found no correlation at all between reaction times and control ratings, which helps. An even better experiment is if you slightly change the interval between the prime and the main arrow, because this is also a mask, right? If you slightly change this interval, you can get the priming effect to flip, and you can get what's called a negative compatibility effect, such that the prime, instead of helping you to respond fast, now makes you respond more slowly, the compatible prime. But the agency ratings do not change. They still show a compatible priming advantage. So that's published in Cognition in 2013. Chambon. Yeah, great question.
Could we come back to the results that you found? We're comparing the two studies of your colleagues. Yeah. On the right side, you also see that the two conditions already are much more different from each other than on the left side, right?
Right, so it starts like this. So
it starts like this,
people
and it
start
keeps
by
like
using,
it
it keeps like this. So these people aren't learning much, perhaps might be a way to put it. Or they're not changing, it's not adaptive. But they are using action, selection, information in making judgments of control, but they're not changing the way that they do so by, for example, becoming more or less reliant on other information about the actual action-outcome relation.
But how do you explain this beginning stuff? Because like you don't know about the variability of your inter-trial.
Well, you're not told about it. You probably experience it.
Need some trials to experience it.
Yeah. I mean, this of course is an average of. This isn't the first block. This is the average of all the blocks in the experiment.
Right.
Right. So I think what I was doing when I was talking about the sort of theory here was I was imagining a situation outside the lab where you come to a completely new action-outcome relation. Obviously, in the experiment, there are several blocks, and we repeat them endlessly. Your comment makes me think that it would be useful to redo this slide with just the first block. That might be relevant, and I think I would have to predict that these begin. Well, I'd have to think about what I predict, but yeah. Yeah.
Is the non-knowledge of the participants of the mechanism of the experiment absolutely necessary? For example, if somebody like you now go and take the test, or a room full of people, like if we go now and take the test after listening to the mechanism of the outcome of how it is done, would that make a radical difference?
In general, it's bad practice because we might all unconsciously try and cheat, even though we shouldn't try and cheat. We might all try to produce the data that supports the hypothesis. In practice, in this experiment, it's quite tricky because remember that you don't actually see the subliminal prime, which forms the central point of the hypothesis. So in principle, if these primes are really subliminal, it should be impossible
Yeah,
to cheat.
exactly
Yeah.
my point.
Yeah. Yeah, in principle, it should be impossible to cheat. It's not an experiment that we've done, but in principle, it's impossible. Yeah.
Do you think it would change if there was some sense of being correct or incorrect in the outcome? So they judge the colour. If there was some benefit, perhaps.
We've done that experiment, and so let me see if I can remember. So it's published in Frontiers in 20-something, and it's Sidaris, Chambon, and Haggard, and I'm rather bad at remembering my own results. However, we did an experiment where you had two actions, and the action could produce a good colour or a bad colour, right? And it was probabilistic, so a given action would produce the good colour 70% of the time and the bad colour 30% of the time, and the priming part was all as before. And the effects of priming on sense of control were stronger for the bad. I'm going to say that wrong. I've said that wrong. It's not good and bad. It's frequent and less frequent. It's not correct and incorrect. It's frequent and less frequent. So on the whole, if you press the right hand, then 70% of the time you get some set of colours, and 30% of the time you get some less frequent colours. With the left hand, it's reversed. So the colours that were unusual for the right hand are usual for the left hand. Okay.
So there's more sense of being correct or incorrect.
Normal or not, yeah,
Yeah, or-
expected or
Right.
unexpected, and that's people are very, post-test people realise which colours went with which hand, so people get when it's sort of the correct action-outcome
Yeah.
relation. And I can't remember whether there was any reward in that experiment, and I can't remember how we did it, so I'm not going to even try and remember that. Anyway, the point is that the priming effect is strongest when you press the button and you get a funny, unexpected, oddball, deviant colour. So the priming effect is strongest when the action-outcome relation is not kind of nice, as expected, as predicted. And that slightly suggested to us that maybe people use selection fluency as a sort of alternative source of information when just relying on feedback about what really happens doesn't work.
Stronger in which direction?
Well, it's always the case that you feel stronger sense of control when you're compatibly primed. So if the prime really makes it easy for you to press the right hand button, but then you get a dodgy outcome which doesn't quite fit, you feel strongly in control when you're compatibly primed compared to when you're incompatibly primed, and that's more true for dodgy outcomes than for normal outcomes. Slightly surprising result, but there it was.
Yeah, I'm just trying to unpick that. So you feel more in control of an unsurprising.
No. Selection fluency contributes more to your feeling of control when the outcome is not as expected compared to when it is as expected. So I suspect that what's happening is when people can't rely on their predictions about the outcome, right? When people can't rely on, or they don't get the outcome that they in a sense want, then they retreat back and they use internal signals about their own choices in term to try and come up with a feeling of control. So it's almost like there's an internal source and there's the external reality, and if the external reality is difficult to understand, they use an internal source.
So does that go back to, you said that, you'd spoken to someone else who put this thought that perhaps fluency and agency were being confused in some way. So would that point to that as a possible answer to that?
It would suggest that people are using fluency as an alternative for agency.
Or as a proxy?
Yeah, but in this case it's anti-correlated with the thing that it's...
So it wouldn't suggest that...
So it's not quite a proxy, I'd say
Right,
it was
okay.
more an alternative. And well, why are they doing that? Well, possibly because we always like to feel we're in control. So if you get some dodgy outcome, then you may not want to accept it, and you may want to revert to saying, well, at least I chose it well.
Right.
Even though the world didn't give me what I expected, at least what I did was fine. Okay, so let's move on now, and let's talk a little bit about a completely different style of study, which is, again, concerned with action selection. Mental chronometry, rotating clocks, don't need to talk about that. person presses a button, they get an outcome, they make a judgment which corresponds either to the position they think the clock hand was at when they pressed the button, or the position the clock hand was at when they heard the tone. A tone is the outcome of these actions. So I'm going to explain that in a moment because it's all really about intentional binding. Do we need to go through intentional binding? Why not? Briefly. So the point about intentional binding is it's possibly an implicit measure of the sense of agency. It's possibly an implicit measure of the sense of agency. And the way it works is by using judgments about when things happen. So just to back up, the rotating clock here, borrowed first from Libet, but then he borrowed it from Wundt and from the tradition of mental chronometry. The rotating clock is a way of getting people to judge when things happen. And that turns out to be very informative about how the mind is representing them. So in intentional binding, you always start off with a block of trials where you're watching the clock going round and round and round. You're not doing anything at all, and you hear a beep. And the clock continues to rotate after the beep happens, then it stops in a random location, and the participant is asked, where was the clock hand when you heard the beep? So the person might say, this is often a problem because red doesn't render very well on the projectors, but the person might say, well, I think I heard the beep about here. So on this timeline, we now have the actual time of the beep and the subjectively perceived time of the beep, what I call the awareness of the beep. Now, you may think it's fascinating, but one common finding is that people often think things happen before they do. You can speculate on how profound that is. But in this case, for example, the person might think they heard the beep a little bit before the beep actually happened. And they've got a judgment error, basically. They're not very good at perceiving when things really happen. All right? So that's fine. That's been known about. That's called cross-modal synchronization or temporal event perception. The question is, can we use this to study agency? And I think probably we can, because we're now going to have another block of trials, completely separate block of trials, where we instruct the participants, press the button anytime you feel like it, so you're making a voluntary action, and then after a constant delay, which is normally in our experiments 250 milliseconds, after a constant delay, your action will make a beep happen. So it's exactly the same beep in this agency block as in this control beep only or non-agency block. But in this block, you have made the beep happen, so you're an agent. And we can ask exactly the same question. When do you think you heard the beep? So we're asking the same question about the perceived time of the beep in both blocks. And the finding is that in the agency block, where people make the beep happen through their own action, they tend to perceive it as shifted earlier in time towards the action by which they had made it, relative to a control condition where the beep just happens. And the critical thing that we actually use as the dependent variable is the average time of many, many different trials in this condition, and the average time of many, many trials in this condition, and we subtract the averages. So you can see there's a dashed line coming down here, and this is the critical thing that we measure, the shift in the perceived time of the beep because I made it happen. All right? So it all looks rather predictive. You're bringing the beep forwards because you made it happen. All right, perceptual shift. Now you can do exactly the same thing on the action side, because you can have a block of trials where you say press the button anytime you feel like it and nothing happens. There's no consequence. So you're not really the agent at all in any external sense, although you might have agency over your own body. And then we have here a block of trials where you press the action and it produces this fantastic transformational event in the outside world because you make this beep happen. And we can ask exactly the same question now about the action. Please tell us where you think the clock hand was when you pressed the button. So here is the time that people report awareness of action in this baseline block, and here is the time at which people think that they press the button, they report awareness of action in this agency block. And you get a shift in the opposite direction so that people think that they press the button later when there's a consequence than when there isn't. All right? So if you just put those two things together, this is the actual sort of important part. In reality, action and beep are separated by 250 milliseconds in these experiments, and that's a constant interval. It has to be a constant interval for this particular measurement. In a voluntary action condition, we can compare the perceived times of actions relative to their respective baselines, which are shown by these dashed lines. And we find there's a shift in the perceived time of action towards the outcome, the beep, and a shift back, hence the negative side here, in the perceived time of the beep back towards the action. These are the magnitudes of the shifts in milliseconds. So we don't directly measure the perceived interval between action and outcome, but we can calculate it by subtracting these shifts from reality. And the take-home finding is that people perceive action and outcome as closer together in time than they really are, or than you would predict they would, given when they perceive the action to happen when it's alone and the outcome to happen when it's alone. So the experience that people have is temporally compressed, linked, bound, and associated through time because they produced the beep by pressing the button. So in that sense, people like, for example, David Hume would not be surprised by this. They'd say, yes, well, of course, it's causation, it's agency, it's association. We're associating action and outcome over time, and temporal contiguity is really, really important part of association. I'm just going to go on to the last sort of point here. So I've called this intentional binding, but I've not justified calling it that at all. So the critical thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a condition where we're going to have exactly the same events, as close as possible to exactly the same events, but without intention. And we're going to use involuntary movements generated by transcranial magnetic stimulation. All right? So just for people who don't know, I'm going to show a 2-minute video. So that was the TMS coil. What have we done? Showing video is always dangerous. Right, so here's a TMS coil. It produces a very high magnetic field which passes unattenuated through the scalp and the skull, in this case over the left motor cortex. And it depolarizes neurons in the cortex. So when that light goes off, my hand twitches because the brain was stimulated and there's conduction down to the spinal cord and the muscles. That wasn't me, that was the experimenter. So watch my right hand. I'm not moving my right hand voluntarily, she's moving it for me. So these muscles are the same muscles that you use to press a button in a voluntary action condition. You can see that the movement isn't quite the same because it's more like a twitch than like a button press, but it's the same muscles. This is when the stimulator is stimulated, this is how long it takes to get down to the muscle, and there's the muscle twitching, it produces that characteristic deflection. So the critical now I think I've cleverly omitted the critical slide, so you'll just have to believe me. Have I omitted the critical slide? Yes, I have. Okay, so I've omitted the critical slide, which is very clever, because you can just believe me that when you replace the voluntary action with a transcranial magnetic stimulation stimulus, you don't get this binding. You get, in fact, perceptual repulsion, so you get a tendency to perceive the action and the beep as being far apart in time. It's possible that it's actually there, but hidden by an occluder. Yes, look. So I'm hoping that if I delete that, no, it's not there. Okay, you'll just have to believe me. I can show you later. You only get this kind of temporal compression between action and beep. When you make a voluntary action, you don't get it for involuntary movements. I can produce that slide if anybody's desperate to see it, but you can just believe me. Yeah?
How does that compare to the control where you don't sort of push the button, but you just wait for the beat to go up? How does that compare to?
In all cases, the inference is based on the difference between the perceived time of an event, which is in an agency condition, and the perceived time of the same event when it isn't. I think I'm going to just take a moment to try and find the slide, because I do apologise. I was tweaking my slides over breakfast, and I obviously made a mistake. So let's just see if we can get an old one. So this part you've already seen. This is the TMS condition. So now what's happening is you have a TMS pulse which is not followed by any beep in one condition, and in another condition you have a TMS pulse which is followed by a beep. And it turns out that the perceived time of the twitches provoked by TMS is 27 milliseconds earlier when they're followed by beeps than when they're not. So you get a perceptual repulsion where the TMS is kept away from the beep. And the perceived time of the beep is later when it follows a TMS pulse than when it just happens. So all of the inference is based on the shifts in the agency condition with respect to, corrected for the baseline. Okay? So whereas you get perceptual attraction for volition, you get perceptual repulsion for non-volition. As if the brain is trying to say, oh, Patrick, don't be fooled by that girl with that TMS coil over your brain. It wasn't you. That beep's got nothing to do with you. Keep them apart. Yeah?
Just so I'm correct, in each case, you're comparing...
The perceived time of an event.
No, hang on.
Sorry.
You're comparing...
Sorry, I should do it.
You're comparing a setup where you have two events, a button push and a beep, with a situation where you have one event,
Correct.
either a button
Correct.
push or a beep.
Correct.
Do you have any thoughts on the framing effects of the two events? I mean, there seems to be something going on, and they're in different directions, so it's not necessarily simple. But is there something to do with having two events?
We've done controls where you have two beeps,
Uh-huh.
and we've done controls where you have two voluntary actions. Okay? You get a little bit of binding for two beeps,
Uh-huh.
but significantly less than action beep.
Uh-huh.
You don't get binding for two actions.
Uh-huh. Okay,
Yeah.
I think that answers it.
So you say that in reality there's 250 milliseconds between action and beep.
Correct.
So how do people perceive the duration between the start of this event and the beep if they are not in the trials where they do not have to push a button at all, not voluntarily or involuntarily?
So those are trials where you're just sitting doing nothing and a beep happens?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So how do people judge those?
Right, but so first of all, we're never judging durations here. You're only judging the timing of a single event. It's always about when does an event happen rather than how long an event is.
Yeah.
Okay? And I'm not quite sure what duration you're talking about. Do you mean the duration between when the clock starts to rotate and when the beep happens?
Yes.
I've never thought about that. I probably should have done, but it's not a question we've asked. You can ask, there's a guy, what's his name? There's a guy who has submitted a paper looking at trying to do all of these things both as event perceptions and as duration perceptions, and trying to work out whether the only reason that the events change is because the perception of the duration has changed. Right? So there's an interesting sort of set of arguments in timing perception about whether duration drives event perception or event perception drives duration perception. It's not a thing I've ever looked at.
But I guess would you predict that it would be like in this direction?
I wouldn't make any predictions. So part of this sort of fiction, if you like, of these experiments is this Libet idea that, watch the clock hand rotating, make a freely willed, voluntary, spontaneous action whenever you feel like it. So the sort of, it is a bit of a fiction, but the concept of these experiments is that the timing at which the action starts is somehow up to the participant, some internal signal which is not really almost even seen in the experiment. It's just assumed to be some sort of initiation or trigger. It's not something I could talk about in these experiments, I think. So that's intentional binding. Is there anything more on intentional binding? Yeah.
Yes. What about the development of skills? Have you had any experiments where the same contestant came every week and did these sessions? So,
Right.
and a lot of computer games are into your action speed and so on. So if people develop the skill, would that interfere with these?
Right, that's a great question. So binding and learning, what can we say about that? First of all, the movements.
Goalkeepers, they
Yeah, the movements here are very simple. So the movement is just to press the button. So that's the first thing. So pretty much everybody can make the movement. You never get any feedback about the time judgment aspect. So you never get told, oh, your judgment of when you press the button was too early or too late or right or wrong. Because if you give people feedback in the time perception experiment, then you won't get any errors. And the errors in time perception are what allow us to make an experiment. So we don't give any feedback. Now there's the other question about if you do this thousands and thousands and thousands of times, what happens? And I don't think we've published anything on that yet, but I can tell you informally that what tends to happen, if you do it thousands and thousands and thousands of times, is that this tends to get smaller, so you tend to perceive the outcome more correctly without any sort of shift, and this tends to get bigger. And what I think is happening is that as you do something more and more, you begin to externalize your representation of it. You begin to, this is what one might call an idiomotor shift. You begin to represent the action not in terms of, I'm going to press the button and it's going to produce the beep, but you start to think beep, beep, beep. You don't somehow almost even see or perceive your command signal, you only perceive the result. So we start to think in terms of the ends rather than the means as we get more experience with something. And that's what the idiomotor principle of action would say, and therefore we perceive the outcomes and we begin to kind of subsume the means of achieving the outcome, shifting the action towards the beep. That's not yet published, but I think it'll be coming sometime soon. Yeah.
So when you're measuring the timing of the TMS, is that the timing of the twitch or is the timing of the twitch causing a button press?
You can't cause a button press by a twitch. So when you fire a TMS pulse, right, you fire the TMS pulse, about 25 milliseconds later, the muscle twitches.
Yes.
And it will be, we know it's the same muscle as you would press a button with, but you can't make people perform functional actions with TMS.
No.
You get things like this.
Yeah.
Right? So there's no actual button press in this condition. What there is a twitch.
Yeah.
And it's the perceived time of the twitch that we use. So I don't know if you saw that muscle trace, we actually measure the perceived time of the onset of the muscle twitch.
Yeah, but if you have a twitch or a voluntary twitch that causes the button press, you will also have EMG rising before you actually electromechanically press the button.
Great point, yeah.
So I was just...
Good point.
If you could do that, just sort of make sure that you can separate those two.
Good point. So for this data, we use the moment that the button clicks, right? And for this data, we use the EMG for the muscle twitch. But remember that what we're actually basing our inferences on is the difference between the perceived time of a click, a key click, when it is followed by a beep versus when it isn't. So, the constant delays will subtract out.
Yeah.
We hope.
Yeah.
So that's part of the sort of concept of the experiment. Right, so that's a little bit about intentional binding, but let's now, of course, I'm now in the incorrect presentation because I had to switch, so excuse me for a moment while I go back to authors. So this is the work of Nima Kalaginajad, who did 7 experiments testing more than 100 people And the experiments were all a little bit different, but we're going to focus here on the action binding. So the action binding is just this rather small shift in the perceived time of the action towards the beep. It's a lot smaller than the tone binding. I think it's actually probably more important and more interesting, so it's what I'm mostly thinking about, because it's the change in the awareness of what you do. All right? So what Nima did is he did a whole slew of Libet experiments, and this is the one sort of typical one. In this case, you have to make a voluntary choice of pressing one key or another, and I think sometimes it was that you choose whether to use your left and right hand. In other cases, you always use your right hand, but you chose between a left or a right key. Depending on which key you pressed, you might have got a low frequency or a high frequency tone, and you judge the time of your action using the Libet clock. So all that's completely standard. And while this is going on, so we're measuring this action binding, while this is going on, we're stimulating the frontal cortex anodally. And in all of these 7 experiments that he did, we always have an anodal electrode over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left side and a cathode supraorbitally on the right side. And we always also have a sham condition in which we apply a little bit of stimulation initially to give you the tingly sensation that somebody's stimulating through the electrode, and then we gradually taper it off so people don't even actually know whether they're being stimulated or not for the 20 minutes or so that they're doing the experiment. Okay, so each subject does 2 sessions of about 20 minutes each. And this is the meta-analysis. So here are a whole slew of experiments, and here's the mean action binding, and that's shown here in the standard meta-analytic way. And it turns out that among the experiments, if you look at the very bottom, this is the overall effect size. So there's just a significant effect of frontal brain stimulation on action binding, and it makes it stronger. So a stimulation of the frontal cortex, which we think is excitatory, so we think that anodal stimulation increases the excitability of the frontal cortex. It tends to make stronger action binding. But the more important thing is that this effect is clearly significant in these experiments which involve endogenous action selection, in which the person chooses for themselves which of 2 actions to make. And this effect is not present in these experiments where you're told what to do or you're always doing the same thing. Okay? So it looks, therefore, as though we've got causal evidence that something in the frontal cortex, which is affected by transcranial direct current stimulation, contributes to action binding and contributes to the sense of agency. So that's quite interesting because it's a direct non-invasive brain stimulation result. In all of these experiments, you have an action, you have an outcome. If you were simply trying to produce your sense of agency by retrospectively looking at what you did and what happened, you wouldn't expect the process in the frontal lobe by which you choose what happens to make any difference. But it does, and we can affect it, and it seems to be something in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we can boost it by upregulating neural excitability in that area. So just to sort of summarize in a bit of a neural model, so our voluntary actions come from the primary motor cortex. We have medial frontal type influences, which we think correspond largely to things like vigor, drive, and motivation. And the lateral prefrontal cortex seems to play a particular role in the selection between alternatives. Remember back in the neurocomputational model, I said there's this selection component. I think it's been neglected in the sense of agency, and I think what this shows is if you interfere with the lateral prefrontal processes of action selection, you seem to increase the binding between what I do and the outcome that happens. And this is quite relevant because there's a big debate going on in the neurophysiological literature about whether our experience of our action is parietal or frontal. And my guess is that what the parietal cortex does is it monitors stuff that's happened. And what the prefrontal cortex does is it sorts out stuff that hasn't happened yet. All right? So depending on whether you're a prospectivist or a retrospectivist about the sense of agency, you'd either love or loathe the finding that frontal brain stimulation, right, associated with selecting what to do before you've actually even done anything, seems to increase your sense of agency over what happens next. Now, I've actually got a third thing, but it's 12, and I wonder whether it's time to stop. Nobody cares about social
We
stuff
have a
anyway
very,
here. You don't have social interaction here, do you?
We have a very open program, so I think if we have 10 minutes more, that's not a problem.
We are
Let's
picking up
keep
to
going.
hear the
Yes.
Yeah, let's
Social
keep
interaction.
We
going.
want to hear it.
All right. Right. So one of the reasons why action awareness and voluntary action and sense of agency, one of the reasons why they're really important is they're traditionally seen as the basis for social responsibility, morality, civilization, all of the things that we know and like. And the critical concept, I suppose, is that if I do something and it was wrong, then I chose to do it. I had the capacity to have selected something sensible or something stupid, and I selected something stupid and it caused a problem, and that's why I'm responsible, and that's why I'm going to be punished. All right, so action selection, the link between selection, agency, responsibility and society, very, very, very strong, fundamental to how we live. And one of the things that's quite interesting is there are a few situations where actually we don't want people using action selection. There are a few situations where we actually don't want people to choose for themselves what they do. Right? So I think it's quite interesting that the military, they really pay attention to prevent people using action selection, or some people using action selection some of the time. So the officer decides what to do, and the soldiers just do it. Another possible, slightly different example is you get situations where standard operating procedures become much, much more important than the concept of an online process of action selection. So the whole link between selection and responsibility is important. And you might ask, well, who's responsible in these kinds of situations? Does the responsibility lie with the person who makes the action or the person who gives the orders? And the standard way that people have thought about this is in the context of the Milgram experiment. So the Milgram experiment strongly linked to the Nuremberg defense, in which senior Nazis denied responsibility for atrocities because they said they were, quote, only obeying orders, unquote, is an absolutely classic legal problem, right, Nuremberg. And Milgram in 1963 did experiments where he asked volunteer participants to apparently do very bad things, like administering extremely painful electric shocks to this individual. So this is an electric shock machine, and this is a person who allegedly is having electric shock administered to them. In fact, it's an actor, it's a confederate, it's somebody who's paid by Milgram to go, ah! Okay, so the whole thing is a pretend, it's a pretense. And Milgram's interest was that most people obey orders. So most normal people can be made to do bad things if you tell them to do it by a coercive instruction. And I sort of thought, well, that's really interesting. I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. I'm never going to work on that. It's a nightmare. No way. And a very determined student of mine said, why don't we do sense of agency in Milgram experiments? And I said, no way, not in my lab, not in a million years. Anyway, we've done them, and now I'm going to tell you. So I have no agency. I was obeying my students' orders. Because there is an interesting question about whether people feel a sense of agency for bad outcomes or not. So, for example, if I claim, I was only obeying orders, I'm not responsible, don't punish me, let me off. Right? If I claim that, for example, in a court of law, there's a really interesting question about, am I just saying that because I know I'll get off and not be punished? Or did I actually feel differently when I did whatever stupid thing I did because I was obeying orders? So there's a really interesting question which I think is not quite resolved in the current literature about whether coercive instructions change the experience of what we do, or whether we just kind of say that afterwards in order to prevent ourselves from being punished for secondary gain. All right, so perhaps people obey, right, so do people feel a sense of agency for bad outcomes when they obey orders? And there's possibly a relevant sort of both psychological, cognitive, and also policy relevance here, because perhaps what Milgram found is that most people will obey orders. Most people will do horrid things if you make them. And perhaps the reason why they do obey orders is because coercive instructions might reduce action selection, by definition, that's what a coercive instruction is. It doesn't give you freedom to select. And maybe, under these circumstances, coercive instruction causes a low sense of agency. Maybe the reason why you can make somebody do something is because they don't feel a strong sense of agency for what they're doing when you tell them to do it. Right, so we tried to do a Milgram experiment, and we tried to do a better Milgram experiment than Milgram did, because there are lots and lots and lots of problems with the Milgram experiment. And I think there are one or two ways in which we've solved some of the problems, but by no means all. So the first thing that we did is we tested participants in pairs. They're volunteer participants who come in, they don't know each other, right? We make sure they don't know each other, they're not friends. And they administer visibly painful electric shocks to each other. So we have 2 volunteer participants, we have an electric shock machine, and they take turns. So in this particular example, this person is the agent, she will make an action, and it will administer a painful electrical shock to this person, who I've put quote victim. I mean, she's not a victim, she's a volunteer participant, she's signed a consent form, and it's all got ethical permission. Right. So that's the basic idea, is that I shock you and then you shock me, and we do that in turns. Now, the shocks are painful, so we calculate the pain threshold, and we know we're above the pain threshold, and they're visibly painful. So this person knows exactly what she's doing to that person because she can see, and also because the roles get reversed. So for half the participants, they're shocking the victim after the victim has shocked them. So they know what the pain is like. They have a direct experience of exactly what they're doing because somebody's done it to them. And that's very different from Milgram, because Milgram used a confederate who pretended that they had received an electric shock. And as far as I can see, the participants in the Milgram experiments kind of didn't really know what was going on. I mean, you could see there was a shock machine, they could see there was a confederate, but they had no direct access to what they were doing. So this is perhaps, well, I don't know if it's fair, but it's at least a bit more transparent. We have 2 conditions. In one condition, the experimenter instructs the agent to give a shock to the victim on some trials, and on other trials, the experimenter says to the agent, press the button, but you're not going to get a shock. The victim will not receive a shock. So you always need to have shock trials and comparison no shock trials. So the coercive instruction that the experimenter gives is a little bit funny, because sometimes she's saying, right, you have to give a shock to her, but in order to have a proper experimental control, we also have randomly interspersed trials where the experimenter says to the agent, press the button, but you won't produce a shock on this trial. Okay, so that's going to be important. I'll come back to that later. The key point here is that this, the agent in this condition has no choice over whether they administer a shock or not. None at all. It's a coercive instruction. The only way they cannot do it is to withdraw from the experiment, which they have to be allowed to do according to ethical principles, Declaration of Helsinki, and also the kind of thing that I allow to happen in my lab.
Did anybody do that?
No, nobody withdrew. Nobody withdrew.
Interesting.
Nobody withdrew. Why did they not withdraw? Well, we can talk about that. But one reason is that although the shocks are painful, they know how painful they are, and they know that they're bearable. They're not pleasant, but they're bearable.
Yeah, I mean, if you have Milgram or something, somewhere in your background, you might think that maybe later I have to do something else, right? So you might be predictive of that. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't think that came out in any of the debriefing questionnaires. Yeah. The comparison condition is this free choice condition. So this is a strange condition. The experimenter is still in the room, but not paying attention, reading a book or looking away. And the agent now can freely choose on any individual trial whether she wants to administer a shock to the victim or not. Right? Now, you would think that, well, why would this person decide to shock that person? In fact, they do it quite a lot. And one of the reasons why they don't do it quite a lot is because this person in the previous block might well have shocked her. So there's a tit for tat. Okay? And in fact, there's a significant correlation between how many times this person shocked that one and how many times they then choose to shock back, which is exactly what sort of neuroeconomics would suggest. Okay? So everybody happy with the basics of implementation? It's based on the Milgram experiment, but I think it's a little bit different in some ways. Now, what about sense of agency? Well, the critical point is that in every trial, let me see if we've got this. Right, so the other way in which we've improved on Milgram, that's right, is we've got an implicit and a mechanistic measure of sense of agency. Because what happens is that you're making an action and you're producing a tone. We've got a slightly different measurement of sense of agency, because what we're now going to do is we're going to slightly vary the action-tone interval, a little bit like we did in the first experiment. And we're going to ask people to give an absolute estimate of how long they think the delay between the action and the tone was. So you're going to press the button, you're going to hear a tone, and then you're going to say, well, I think that was about 427 milliseconds. Or, oh, I think that was about 678. So we're jittering this interval and we're asking people to estimate it. And intentional binding corresponds to people perceiving the action-tone interval as shorter than it really is. So we can get at the same underlying theoretical construct of intentional binding using this different and much, much, much faster method of just saying, please tell me how long you think the delay was between the action and the tone. And we're going to measure the EG response to the tone. And we're going to do that in 4 conditions. So let's look first of all at the coercion condition. So in the coercion condition, there are 2 types of randomly intermixed trials. There are trials where the participant says, the experimenter says, press the button, but you're not going to produce any shock on the victim in this case. So there's only an action followed by a tone, and you judge the delay. In other trials, the experimenter says, right, you've got to administer a shock to her. So press that button, and at the moment that you hear the tone, she's going to get a painful shock exactly at the same time. And of course, the participant can see that the person gets the shock because they flinch. And please judge the interval between the action and the tone. Then we have the free choice condition where the participant chooses for themselves whether to press one key which shocks the victim or press another key which doesn't. In all cases, exactly the same tone is present. The intervals between action and tone are always within exactly the same range, and the person just has to indicate how long the delay is. All right? Everybody happy? That 2x2 design's sort of the key to the thing.
Super cool.
Well, okay, so now here's the key result. So the key result for interval estimation is done like this. You plot we do it like this. You plot the action-tone interval along the x-axis, and you plot the person's subjective report, their estimate of the action-tone interval in milliseconds, they're just giving a verbal report, on the y-axis. So as the actual action-tone interval gets longer, people perceive that it gets longer because all the lines are monotonic. So that means that people are perceiving the intervals sort of correctly. Now, there are big differences in what you think is 300 milliseconds and what I think is 300 milliseconds. That doesn't matter because it's within the subject's design. And really what we're interested in is not the slope of this line, but the intercept. Because if you've got really, really strong binding, if you tend to perceive the outcome action-tone intervals as very short, you'll have a low intercept, and we'll infer that you have a strong sense of agency over the tone, over the outcome. And if you perceive the interval as very long, then we'll say you have less sense of agency. And that, I think, follows from the intentional binding concept. It's sort of what David Hume would have said, so maybe it's right, etc., etc. Right. In black, what you have is the interval estimates when people freely choose whether to administer a shock or not, and what they're always judging is the interval between the action and the tone that coincides with the shock. Okay? And in grey, when they're coercively instructed. So the critical point to notice is that there is an increase in time perception, in interval duration perception, which we interpret as being a reduction in the sense of agency when you're told what to do versus when you choose what to do. That's really all the result is, right? So the important point is it's an implicit measure result, right? You're just asked to report the time. You're not asked anything about morality. Would you do it? Did you enjoy it? Are you responsible? You're not asked any of that. You're just asked, how long did it take? And it looks as though people perceive that the interval was longer, implying that they had less sense of agency when they're given the coercive instruction. So I actually find this scary. This is not the result that I wanted. I don't like it at a personal level at all. But that is the result. So there we are. Can I just finish the other accessory bits of result, and then I think we can have some questions. So what that would appear to imply, oh yeah, here's the EG, right? So at the same time we can measure the brain response to the tone, So this corresponds, this is the auditory evoked potential. So here's the tone. And in blue, you have the free choice condition. In light blue, you have the free choice condition. So here's the brain responding to the tone when you've chosen whether to shock or not. And in the coercive condition, where you're told that you're going to shock or not, the brain, as it were, doesn't respond as much to the tone as when you've chosen. So coercion seems to reduce the processing of outcomes. Now, a really important point here is that these are main effects of how you choose, whether you choose for yourself or whether you're coerced and obeying orders. There is no interaction either on the subjective side or on the electrophysiological side with whether the outcome was a shock or no shock. There's no effect of what you actually do. What matters is whether you chose to do it. All right? So it's not an outcome monitoring problem. So in the trials, you can see quite clearly whether you caused a shock or whether you didn't, because you know what button you pressed, and you can see whether the person expressed pain or not, and you know whether the experimenter told you that you have to give the shock or not give the shock on this particular trial. So it's a pure effect of choice context, not an effect of choice outcome, which is interesting. And I think extremely worrying. I think it's extremely scary. I don't like it at all, but there it is. So it looks as though, I think we've got to conclude some summary, it's an interim discussion. So people often claim reduced responsibility when they're only obeying orders. So people often say, I had no choice. It's a common thing that we hear a lot in society. The surprising and I think rather scary conclusion of this experiment is that they may also experience less, well, agency. I'm not sure about experience of responsibility. They may also experience less agency over what they're doing because somebody else told them to do it. The perhaps slightly optimistic outcome here is that maybe this is the start of an explanation of why people obey bad orders. So maybe the reason why people can be coerced into doing things is because they don't feel quite enough sense of agency over what happens next. And then at least you could train them to do so. Then at least you would know how to intervene. Then at least you'd know how to say, well, you ought to feel more sense of agency here. You should be able to train it. So what this means, I think, is that societies and systems need to manage the sense of agency and the attribution of responsibility very carefully, because people in social situations can be made to feel lack of agency when, in fact, they press the button. So that's, I think, summary of the three experiments that I've talked about with different mechanisms and styles of subjective judgment. They've all been about this problem of selecting what do I do. I think it's important for sense of agency, and there's some general conclusions. I think we can study the sense of agency. I think we do know what we're doing, and I think there I differ from the Dennett-Wegener view. So the Dennett-Wegener view, in its strictest sense, suggests that we don't know what we're doing, we don't know what we're choosing. I think an experience of choosing underpins the experience of control. And the mildly comforting news for society might be that our brain hardware allows us to experience a sense of agency which can at least support social responsibility. So that's a good time to stop for questions. Yeah?
Thank you, that's really interesting. Just to step back, question about that last experiment. When they were being coerced, were they told to give a shock or not give a shock now? So there was
on each trial. So at the start of each trial, the experimenter said, right, on this trial you have to give her a shock. And on other trials, the experimenter said, right, on this trial you have to press the other button, and that won't give her a shock.
And it was kind of...
And it's randomised.
And it was
It's
one-off.
randomised.
Each one was done as a
It's one block, but it's randomised whether the experimenter tells you shock her or press the other button, don't shock her.
But there's no... And you could do it as many times as you wanted within that block?
So I'm talking about the coercive block where the experimenter tells you what to do. So there's no question of anybody wanting to do anything.
So
there's also a free choice block where the agent, the participant, can choose for themselves whether they wish or don't wish to administer an electric shock to the other participant. And they get 40 trials, and it's entirely up to them whether they shock her 40 times or 0. It's up to her, up to the agent.
So what I was trying to understand was whether there was a priming from the experimenter saying, do something now, in one condition that wasn't there in the other.
That's a good point. Okay, so that's counterbalanced. So half of the subjects will have done the free choice part before the coercive part. And that will have been a factor in the ANOVA, and I don't remember it being important. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's just
yeah.
because it's a temporal thing. If you have some priming,
You might emulate the experimenter.
Yeah, yeah.
So the
Yeah.
experimenter is horrible, so I'll be horrible too. Well, that's really scary. It probably could happen, but I don't remember it being. I don't remember the counterbalancing order being significant. There were actually two experimenters, and we also tested whether one of them was more successfully coercive than the other, and they weren't. And you'll also notice it's all female. So female experimenters and all female participants. I can't remember who's next. I think you were next.
I'm just wondering, I'll come back to, I come from the game space as such, and I work with games. So I was just wondering, I mean, in both the sense of agency choice and stuff, I mean, it's not my area, but I was just wondering if you actually add a cost to the action, a much more significant cost. I don't know how experimentally it can be done, where in a virtual situation you could create a life or death situation, for example.
Yeah.
Would that actually, I mean, that would be at least testable in a video game setting, for example, or something.
Yeah.
And I think that would at least give you different results than what you see.
I think that's right. So I think, I mean, I've talked a lot about actions and voluntary actions and action selection, and in philosophy, what people say is we make actions for a reason. And in neuroscience, we say we make actions to get reward, which has a quite interesting difference, right? Or to avoid cost. So the reason in neuroscience is basically, I don't know, money or food or something like that. And that's something which has not been strongly manipulated in these experiments. So it's quite difficult to really convincingly operationalize reward in these experiments, because, for example, if you give people a choice, I'm talking about action selection, so suppose I ask you to select between two alternative actions, and one of them gives you, I don't know, 5 kroner, and the other gives you an electric shock, right? Well, it's not going to be a great experiment, because what I want to do is I want to compare the sense of agency between the two conditions, but I'm not going to get many trials in the electric shock condition. So it's really quite tricky in these experiments to compare the subjective experience between actions which have low cost, high cost, low reward, high reward, because, you know, by definition, people choose the high rewarding outcome. So it's quite tricky to get really balanced experimental designs. We have tried that within the context of reversal learning. And I think so none of it's published yet, and are there really interesting, strong effects of reward that we want to talk about? I mean, I think there must be, right? So I think we feel perhaps the best way to think about this is in terms of the Bandura effect. So Bandura, social psychologists, notice that people tend to dramatically overestimate their own agency, particularly when the outcomes are good. So you see this in a team project, right? So if the project works well and the experiment produces a significant result in a Nature paper, then it was all down to me. And if the hypothesis is not fulfilled and the computer breaks, well, it was your fault. It wasn't me. So that's often handled under the concept of diffusion of responsibility or self-attribution. And self-attribution biases are strong, and they exist in they affect these kinds of implicit measures as well, but I haven't talked about it today. I don't know who was next. Aaron, why don't you go next, because you didn't ask before.
What about the control condition? It would be interesting to know if this was an attractive effect or a repulsive effect. You only showed 2 conditions, but you did have this other condition where
Are we talking about the last experiment?
Yeah. There was a tone and no shock. Is it in the middle of the other 2?
Right. So this condition here, right? So there's no difference in interval estimates between the conditions between the trials where there's no shock and the trials randomized into the same block where there is a shock. So there's no significant main effect of outcome, and there's no interaction. So what you get is a significant effect of choice context, whether you're coerced or free on the subjective duration here, but there's no significant effect of outcome. Does that answer your question?
So you get the same result whether there's a shock or no shock?
Correct. Surprisingly. So the experience, This is an implicit measure of sense of agency. You might question the measure, but this measure isn't sensitive to the simultaneous shock. It's only simultaneous to how the choice occurred. So the only significant main effect
Is whether it was coerced.
whether
or-
you were coerced or not what happened. It's what matters is the context in which you choose, not the result of your choice. So, which again is surprising, but that's the data.
Could I just jump in here, just for that
Yeah.
point? Could you go back to the quadrant you had? So I was wondering, when you have this grid here with plus painful shock, right? If you were to add something where, for example, because here the experimental, the victim is just getting a shock by the press of a button, right? So someone just presses
so
a
the
button.
agent presses a button which delivers a shock to the victim
Yeah. So if I'm just
and a tone at the
yes,
same
I'm
time.
just thinking out loud here. So if, for example, you were to make a situation where you had, let's say, a gradation of the pain you could cause, even though the actual pain you would get would still be the same all the time, but you could say, like, mild pain, high pain, extremely excruciating pain. And
That-
something like that,
That was Milgram's approach. So he had a variable, a lever on the shock box, and he said to subjects, well, start with this level and now put it up to the higher level, and he sort of had this graded levels, yeah.
Okay, so but with that graded level where you actually don't get that shock, but it's just you're
You think you're giving
thinking
it.
you're
Yes.
giving it.
Yeah.
Would that also then cause any? Because then people would have a much more choice about. Okay,
Yeah,
this could
that's
be
true.
very.
You'd have more choice. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That's interesting. When I was sort of bullied into doing this experiment, the one principle that I clung to was that I didn't want to deceive anyone. So the situation that you suggest would involve the agent being deceived because they would think they controlled the amplitude of the shock that the victim got, but actually they wouldn't. And I sort of decided I wasn't going to do that because I didn't think it was fair. At least this experiment's completely transparent. So, if you don't like it, which you might well not, you can withdraw. And there's no kind of fiction. Yes, hi.
How did you get people to shock each other then? How, in the free will condition, what,
Oh yes, that's a good point. Quite simple. Money.
they would get more money for shocking
Yeah.
more times?
Really?
Money.
How much?
Not entirely free choice then.
So if you think about, it's quite interesting. There's a modest reward. That's right. There's a modest reward, and I can't remember what it is. It's at 5p or something. And in a way, that's not the point. So big motivations in human action are greed and fear. So if you look at the way, I don't sort of do this very often, but if you read things about stock markets, which are very, very sort of interesting laboratories for behaviour, the big drivers of behaviour are greed and fear. And I think that's, it's true in this experiment because people are greedy for money, but I think it's true outside the lab as well. Yeah.
Two questions. In the free choice condition, had they any previous experience about how painful was the shock?
Yeah.
And also, did they develop any kind of, you suggested they had some kind of game, you shock me, now I shock you back. Did they develop some narrative there, wow, now I get you, or this kind of, made it into a game?
Right, so the first point is, did they have any previous experience? Yes, the answer is they did, because at the very start of the experiment, they both had electrodes put on, each of them, and the experimenter went through a procedure for establishing the shock that produced painful sensation, and each person saw the other person having the pain threshold calibrated, so they knew what pain was like, and they knew that the other person was having something similar. So that was all completely clear. In terms of game, they did get into games because, as I think I mentioned earlier, the roles reversed from block to block. And if this agent had chosen to administer a lot of shocks to this victim, then when the roles reversed, this victim tended to give a lot of shocks back. So there was a correlation between how much you got and how much you gave. Now, whether you want to think about that as a game, I don't know. In debriefing questionnaires, there was a semi-structured interview at the end, and people quite often said, well, I felt a little bit bad about doing it, but she did it to me. So people seem to be thinking about it in those ways. But that's...
They're not interacting, but like talking, now you get it, or...
No. No, and they weren't encouraged to do that. So they'd never met before they came to the lab, and they weren't encouraged to sort of fraternise, and we didn't want people who already knew each other. And we made sure that they were paid separately and left separately at the end of the experiment.
Well, like paintball, I have not been taking part of it, but in paintball games it can be painful, but people love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a very interesting question about whether people were sort of bonding with each other and entering into some sort of cooperation, which I bet they were. I mean, cooperation is a natural human behaviour, so it's quite possible. But it wasn't something we particularly operationalised in the experiment. I'm going to take you first and then you second. Yeah.
Just a couple experimental design detailed questions. Were the participants asked if they were familiar with the Milgram experiment? How much were they paid? I'm just curious what the incentive, how big it was, and what were they told the stated purpose of the experiment was?
Right, so they weren't asked about the Milgram experiment. They were paid at this, there's an approved institutional rate which we have to use, which is £7.50 an hour. And then they were paid a bonus according to how many shocks they gave.
Okay.
And we set the bonus level so that they could not ever, the most they could do was double their pay. Right, so we tend to not allow runaway bonuses. It's not like the stock market in that respect. We tend to have some sort of control over the bonus level. And then your last question...
The stated purpose, what did they think
stated
they were
purpose of the
able to
experiment,
do?
right. So the experiment will have been advertised under a title rather than with the purpose. So the experiment will have been advertised as an experiment on time perception, which it was. And there will have been mention of electric shock stimuli. You're talking about the recruitment when people see the advertisement.
Yes, I'm just curious as they're sitting there what they think they're being observed for.
Absolutely right. And there's been an interesting debate, it's not quite my area, there's been an interesting debate as to whether the Milgram experiment could possibly ever be redone because there are no naive subjects. I'm not too worried about that. I think what these...
Just curious.
Yeah, I think you know, if these experiments are any good, what they do is they bring into the laboratory something which is sort of there outside it, and they're never going to operationalise that perfectly. You can never bring real life perfectly into the lab. Then there's a question about whether you change it so much that it's not even worth doing, and other people have to form their judgment about that. So it may be that experiments are, you know, not convincing enough to have been worth doing, and then people should say that, and I'll try and listen.
I think I'm more curious if they were aware at all that they were in a moral dilemma, or if it was just kind of, in some sense, assumed that because it was a tolerable, bearable level of shock.
Right, it's clear from the debriefing questionnaires. Sorry, if I
It's
can
safe.
interrupt. It's clear from the debriefing questionnaire they knew it was safe. They knew that it was painful, but not unbearable, because that was how we set the pain threshold. That it was painful but not unbearable. They knew that from their own experience. They knew that was what they were inflicting on others. I think in the debriefing questionnaires they clearly felt bad about it. They said, I didn't much enjoy that, but they didn't feel deeply disturbed by it either, which is good, because then we would have had to report that as an adverse event. Now there was a question. Yeah, and then you. So yes, please.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for a very interesting talk. And secondly, I wonder if the difference you find between the coercive instruction and the free choice condition could be accounted for by something similar to task difficulty. And if you know of any, or if you yourself have done studies on the effect of task difficulty on sense of agency.
Right, and I think probably there's an element of that which is quite important. So if you look at these free choice conditions, there are two possible actions that you can do. You can either choose to press button A and give a shock, or button B and not give a shock. If you look at this thing, then the experimenter says, press button A and give her a shock, press button B and don't give her a shock. So the response space, to use Chris Frith's word, the response space here is 2, and the response space here is 1. So, you know, there's a whole lot of social, dressage, or social embellishment in this experiment, but maybe it's just as simple as whether you select between alternative actions or you don't. So, you know, it looks like it's all about Milgram, and it looks like it's all about social responsibility, but maybe that's the same thing as choice between alternatives. And maybe what coercion is not particularly related to pain or shock or being nasty. It's just related to not having an alternative option. And possibly a weak point in this experiment is there's a very cool experiment by Barlas and Obi, who did an intentional binding study. I can't remember if it was event perception or whether it was interval estimation, I can't remember. It was published in 2014. And they simply varied the number of possible actions you could make. So in one condition, you always press the same button and you got a tone. In another condition, you had to choose between 2 buttons. In another condition, no, it wasn't. It was 1, 3, or 7 buttons that you could choose between in different blocks. And the more choice you had, the bigger the response space, the stronger the binding. And I think this might be exactly the same result. The problem with that experiment, the Barlas and Obi experiment, is that whichever button you pressed, you always got the same tone. And that's a little bit unusual, because normally the reason why we choose alternative actions is to get alternative outcomes. So in that sense, this design might move a little bit beyond that Barlas and Obi paper. Yes?
Thank you very much. Also, just a small comment. This relates a lot also to what you said. We tend to assume more responsibility for positive outcomes. But if
claim more responsibility for positive outcomes, yeah.
But if this is true, that it's merely a matter of the response space, then if you add a positive condition where people can give rewards to each other voluntarily or by coercion, then you would expect, according to that hypothesis, the same result, right? That there's no main effect of whether the outcome is positive or negative, but only of whether it's a free choice or a coercive action.
Yeah, this doesn't look like the self-serving bias overestimation of agency for positive outcomes, because if it had, you would have expected a stronger sense of agency when there's a relatively positive outcome than when there's a clearly unpleasant one.
I would call this one neutral. So if people could give each other, I don't know, 1 crown, and then you see, if you say, okay, now give him 1 crown, and
now
you can choose to do it, whether people...
That would be interesting to do. That would be interesting to do, and you could present it in terms of one of those kind of dictator or ultimatum, or one of the many games which now are so widely used. Andreas?
Yeah, I mean, as always, so clever experiments and so much food for thought. So in a way, you know, you said that we do know what we're doing, and experience of choosing underpins our experience of control. Right? And I think this is a really powerful statement. And in interesting ways, it's also giving kind of a slight correction, to say the least, to what has been the American interpretation. It's almost as if we have a loop of Libet, Wegner, and Dennett, and before that Milgram, who has basically been kind of pushing that idea forward, that, you know, at the end of the day, we're only talking about rationalizations after the fact.
That's
so
what
that kind of American loop, is that really a conceptual detour that we should just stay away from? Or was anything learned from that tradition that needs to be taken into account? Because it's really an aggressive, almost, attack at what has become the dominant view.
My attack is aggressive, or their view is aggressive.
I think yours is kind of, you know, an aggressive in a good sense.
Sorry, I dislike aggression profoundly. Yes,
and it's important, right? Because there's a lot of...
Well, I happen to think it's important. It's a really great question, although it's a very tricky one, because I have a feeling that whatever I say, it could be misjudged. I think there's no doubt that, I think let's leave Libet out of it, because Libet's not part of this. He happened to be interested in moral responsibility, but he's not part of this sort of discourse. I think there's no doubt that the Dennett, and more particularly Wegener was very careful about what he said, but the Dennett-Wegener axis, there's no doubt they're right. No doubt about it. There's no doubt that we rationalise what we do post-hoc. Self-serving bias, Bandura, is a prime example of that. The retrospective reconstruction of our own action is extremely strong. The question is whether that's all there is. And if you read, or the sort of line of the Wegener experiments suggests that that's all there is. In fact, if you read Wegener's theory, it's not quite what he says. He says that there's a thing called prior conscious thought, which is not quite, the ontology of that's not quite clear to me. If you read Dennett, then Dennett doesn't sort of get into the sort of moral implications as much. As I understand it from Dennett, what Dennett is doing is pointing out the enormous importance of reconstruction and multiple cuts and multiple drafts and the sort of editing of conscious experience. Dennett doesn't say much about sort of control. I think he's just concerned with the mash-up of consciousness and the reconstruction of consciousness. But I think I hesitate to criticise either Dennett or Wegener, but I think what the field has taken from their work, often not reading what they actually say sufficiently carefully, is all of our experience of everything we do is just a reconstruction. We don't know what we're doing. There is no such thing as control, and we're just kidding ourselves with a kind of narrative confabulation which our mind produces. And I think that position's too strong, because I think there are processes of action selection, and I think they are bona fide brain processes. They're not just, I don't think we just tell ourselves after the event, oh yes, of course I chose this. I think there is actually something happening in our brains at the moment of choice. I don't believe it's, quote, free will, unquote. I'm not sure I believe in free will. I'm not sure it's helpful to call it that. I think there is a process of action selection. I think that contributes to our experience of what we're doing. And I think it's important. I don't think it's sufficient to ground responsibility. I don't think it's sufficient to give us responsibility. But I think if you didn't have I was preparing these during the previous talk because I liked the discussion. Could you have a society whose members lacked a sense of agency? I think the answer is no. So I don't think you can actually get people living together unless you have some sort of concept that people do things, that they perform actions which produce outcomes. And I think you can't get that unless you have some sort of concept of action selection. And you can't link action selection to responsibility if it's pure confabulation. So I think the American view has been too aggressive. I don't think I'm too aggressive. I think they're too aggressive, because I think what they've done is they've oversold and overclaimed the impact of the Dennett-Wegener hypothesis. I don't think either Dennett or Wegener went that far, but the zeitgeist in the US has thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
But the reason why I would like to track it back also through Lippert and Milgram is, you could argue that what Lippert in a way is saying is that, that the notion of selection is not what matters, but you might be able to stop an action. That's kind of where the free will can come in the simple-minded view of it. And going back to Milgram again, he would say, well, at the end of the day, it's really the experimenter who has the control. It's not your own free choice. So in almost ironic kind of way, even though the American idea is so much about the free will and the choice, then actually these three key psychologists have, in a way, been doing what they could to suggest that it's not about that particular moment of choice. It's all sorts of other things that come around it.
We need to be careful with our use of the word American, because this is not about it's not an American cultural studies seminar. Of course, there's no no comment there. It's more to do with the scientific trend, isn't it, rather than where it happens. But there's clearly an interest here in what is the individual, what is the self, what is their relation to society. And I think, I mean, there's clearly some very interesting cross-cultural questions. So, as I understand it, Chris Frith disagrees with this first point. So here I'm speculating that you couldn't have society without some sort of, frontal cortex process of action selection and experience that the action that you select then has impacts on other people and sense of agency. And apparently, according to Chris Frith, there are peoples who don't have concepts of responsibility at all. I'm not quite sure. I haven't read the primary evidence. So there are interesting cross-cultural questions, which are questions really about what an individual is, and that's a classic, I'm sure, a classic issue in social anthropology more widely.